Now let's talk about GDP, gross domestic product. That was the total value of all the final goods and services produced within a country within a year, right? That's what GDP was, and every part of that was important, right? It is measuring the economic performance. It's only looking at the durable goods, non-durable goods, services, building structures, and inventories, right? That's what we're looking at. We are not looking at anything that is an intermediate good, such as steel for a car, because we're looking at the final good. And the final good is the car. That's what GDP measures. Okay? We're not going to count any used goods. So if the car was 2020 and you bought it in 2024, that's not an increase in GDP. In 2020, yeah, because it was new. But in 2024, no, because it's a used good. Right? Anything produced by domestic citizens in foreign countries is not going to count. Non-market transactions, that's where like you mow your lawn for your neighbor and they pay you cash and you don't tell the government about it. Like that's not a business, but you got cash for it. That doesn't count either. Underground economy, that's anything illegal that the government doesn't know about. And any transfer payments. So anything from the government, you know, like a extra increase of unemployment insurance, that's not GDP. GDP is actual production. And just because I give you more money, that's not going to increase production. Like you actually have to take the money and then produce something. That's when it counts. But the actual transfer payment itself doesn't count. We have different approaches to measuring GDP. We looked at one with the apples and oranges. Like price of apples, $2. You buy 5 of them, that's $10. So GDP would be $10. So that's the production approach. Just like the price of it and how much you have, that's GDP. Okay, that's the production approach. The income approach is looking at, you know, the different forms of income, wages, interest, rent, profits. But the more important one that we looked at this year was the expenditure approach, right? We looked at consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports. All of these things we added together to create the GDP. Okay? All right, so there's some explanation for each one, right? For C, I, G, and X that you can read through. Just so you know, this is gross national product. Gross national product is looking at GDP, how much you're producing, minus any depreciation, plus any subsidies you get, plus any net income of domestic workers. So with GDP, we don't count anything that is made outside the country. But with national income, if you are an American citizen living outside of the U.S. and you're making production for the U.S., that counts towards the national income. It doesn't count towards GDP, but it does count towards national income. And so GDP has this circular flow of consumption and firms to where we are creating more GDP. We do have a thing called leakage and injections. Leakages are where money's leaving the system, such as taxes, savings, and imports. This is where if you're not buying at like grocery stores and things like that, that means you're either saving your money or you are buying something from another place, like another country, or you have to give your money to taxes. Okay, that's why you're not spending your money at the grocery store. It's because you're doing those 3 things. Now, on the other side of those, if you get a saving, if you put money in savings, someone's taking that out as an investment, right? If you pay your taxes, the government's using that for spending. And if you're buying something from another country, they're buying from you, so that would be exports. Okay, so that's what GDP is. Now remember, there is a difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. Real GDP is using base year prices. Real GDP is adjusted for inflation. Right? Remember, nominal was the current price times the current quantity. So just price times quantity, easy. Real GDP was looking at the base year price and the quantity. So if real GDP, right, increased, that meant you made more things. If real GDP stayed the same and nominal increased, that could have meant that you had an increase in prices. Okay. So here's another example of calculating the nominal GDP if you want to run through that. And then we also looked at real GDP if you wanted to take a look at that as well. Now, with those numbers, with the real and the nominal GDP, we can calculate the GDP deflator, which was just the nominal GDP divided by the real GDP. That's what the deflator was. It was a price level. What it's telling you is basically how much our price is changing over time, right? If we have the nominal GDP and the real GDP, we know production. And so what is the difference between nominal and real? Like this gap here, like I like to think about it as like a lemon meringue pie. So here's the lemon, and here's the meringue. I can't spell it, but you know, like we have this part here. This part is the inflation, like the change in the price level. And here is what's really going on. So in this case right here, whatever nominal is doing, right, up, down, right, real stays here. So if nominal goes up, the meringue, right, if the meringue goes up and that makes nominal GDP up, but real stays the same, well then that meant that there's more inflation. So in this case, GDP deflator is going to tell you if there's more meringue or not. So basically, if you were to just take the nominal GDP divided by the real GDP, that gives you the deflator. And once you know that, you will then be able to see like if the deflator is going up, that means there's more inflation. The next thing we need to talk about is the business cycles. So whenever there is the GDP is going up, that's an expansion. Like your economy is getting bigger, so expansionary, right? So if you are expanding, you're making more things. Now, eventually what's going to happen is you're going to reach what is called the peak, the top of the expansion phase. After the peak, you have a contraction, and a contraction is GDP decreases. Contraction. At the bottom of the contraction is what we call a trough. A trough is the bottom of the contraction. Now, after that is the expansion. Okay? So that's what we're going with here. Okay? Now, when we have contractions, that's where GDP is decreasing. When GDP is going down, that's where you have more unemployment, right? You need less production, less people, more unemployment, right? And so during an expansion, right, you need to make more things. If you need to make more things, then you need more people, so unemployment goes down. Right? So that is how the business cycle works. It fluctuates all the time. Now, the next thing we need to talk about is the Consumer Price Index. Now, remember, we looked at the Consumer Price Index in order to look at inflation. The CPI, Consumer Price Index, is measuring what you as a typical consumer are buying. Okay? So that's what we're looking at. Like the things in your basket, the things that you buy when you go to the grocery store, or if you're trying to buy a car and a house, right? What is the value when you go to check out? So there's a couple of methods we can do to really find that out. But once we figure it out, it's going to give you a number. Okay. Now, this number, this CPI, is just an index, right? We use this index to find the inflation. So what you're going to do is you're going to take the old CPI minus, oh, I'm sorry, you're going to take the new CPI minus the old CPI and divided by the old CPI. Remember, for inflation, what you're doing is you're doing the new minus old divided by old. Okay, that's what you're doing for inflation. You're trying to find the percent change. That's what you're trying to find. Okay. So for CPI, you're just going to find the value of the basket, figure out how much it was in each year. That'll give you the CPI. With the CPI, you can figure out the inflation. Okay? Now, there is a difference between CPI and GDP deflator. CPI, looking at the consumer, right? Very narrow look at what's going on. Very useful. GDP, much more broad. We're looking at everything, right? We're looking at consumers, firms, government, and net exports. That's what we're looking at with GDP deflator. Okay? But again, inflation, no matter if it's CPI or GDP deflator, new minus old divided by old. Now, inflation does have some cost. So, if your wages can't keep up, you're losing your purchasing power. You can buy less things. Another thing is that higher inflation will mean that borrowers are going to gain and lenders are going to lose. When there is inflation, borrowers win. When there is deflation or lower inflation, borrowers lose. Okay? So the lenders win. That's what's happening with inflation, is this redistribution of wealth. With inflation, lenders lose. Now, if you are trying to figure out, an interest rate that you want to do, you should use this formula. This formula is very, very useful. You can use it for interest rates. You can also use it for GDP. So, like if I told you that the nominal GDP increased by 10%, and I told you that the real GDP increased by 6%, well, then you could use this formula. Nominal equals real plus inflation. So what you would do is you would do nominal equals real plus inflation, so plus x. And so what happens here is you say x equals 4. So then you would say inflation equals 4. Okay. So this formula, very, very useful. The next video we'll talk about unemployment. I'll see you there. Bye.